And just like that, we are in our final session. Good to see what a great day we've had here at the Global Business of Data Festival. Now, some would argue I'm saving the best for last. We are joined on stage now by Naomi Freeman, who's a CTO and Senior Leadership Fellow for Women Who Code London. Naomi, it's a pleasure to have you, and I'm really looking forward to the topic that you're going to be talking about today, but I'm going to hand it straight over to you.
Thanks so much, Catherine. It's been really great just watching some of the other sessions here today and to really see some of these perspectives from these different companies and the kinds of pivots that we've been experiencing. Today, I'm here to talk about this very weighty sounding topic, human versus machine, how to avoid a war on AI. I hope that you will enjoy this topic as much as I have enjoyed kind of diving into how we think a little bit more about what all of these new relationships look like with technology as we pivot. So here's a photo of myself with myself on the screen. It'll be over in a second. I'm super glad to be joining you here virtually today at the Business of Data Festival. My name is Naomi Freeman, and I'm currently working as a subject matter expert in technical management at North Accelerate. Last year I was working as a CTO, and previous to that I've been a lead developer, an AI engineer, and company co-founder at various times. And I'm also still with Women Who Code on the Strategy and Technology Board Committee. Prior to that, I was with Women Who Code as a fellow in data science, AI, and blockchain for 2 years throughout the pandemic. It was an extraordinary time to be working on those problem sets. And this is all just to say that I've worked both on the people side and the machine side of AI and the workplace. And it's always really interesting to think about how we move forward with both of those at the same time. So, since the beginning of what we know as humankind, we have crafted machines to help us. And what we're seeing today in this moment is an acceleration of this process. Part of the hastening is the result of having reached a sort of tipping point. We are no longer actually required to transfer human knowledge to a machine for it to become smarter. We have forged machines that can learn on their own by observing us, making sense of big data, and watching experiences as they unfold on the web. So technology is providing new and more innovative ways to augment us as human beings and enable us to better respond to a world that's moving at a faster and faster pace. It's much more easy to secure the all-important competitive edge for businesses and industry with a couple of clicks of a button. And in that sense, it becomes even harder because so many folks have access to so many tools at the same time. Institutions and governments are facing mounting social costs, while communities and individuals are all looking for healthier, happier lives, right? We might not wake up and say, oh, sustainability is the thing that's on the top of my mind. But I do think that a lot of us as individuals, as teams, we're wondering, what is it that I'm kind of adding to the footprint in the world? How can I do this a little bit better? These challenges and aspirations are pressing researchers to push past technology's boundaries, to develop smarter machines, since these intelligent constructs represent the most practical way that we have access to right now to augment our capabilities. And here with any augmentation, we're simply meaning how we can expand our abilities as people and make them bigger or better in some sort of way. And that could be physically lifting things with a forklift, for example. That could be an augmentation. Or it could be about creating extended realities with new VR headsets. It's extending our perception. It's extending our ability to manipulate space, right? To be sure, artificial intelligence has also progressed significantly, though it's been more in terms of its applicability than in terms of absolute theoretical progress. So AI can do a lot more today because processing power is abundant, cheap, and almost ubiquitous. And this, along with pervasive communications and sensors and storage capabilities, has helped lead to this inflection point we're talking about in the availability of data. And the consequence is twofold. The data space is so big. The data space is so big that it is beyond human comprehension. And this is fueling, in turn, machines' capabilities, their intelligence, and their continuous learning. The more data you give a machine, the more it's going to do with the data. And the larger the data space becomes, and the wider the gap between us and our ability as humans to comprehend this, and the machine's ability to continue producing new data that it's feeding on. And it feels pretty overwhelming as a technologist to be thinking about this and how it's accelerating. But for me, one of the most overwhelming things is this process has only just begun, and there's really no end in sight. Machines have evolved beyond their clockwork origins and are likely to surpass humans in a growing number of areas. And when we make use of machine learning and AI to assist with technical tasks like data preparation, insight generation, insight explanation, we create an entire new field called Augmented Analytics. So making use of these enabling technologies augments how people can explore and analyze data, both in analytics and with things like BI platforms, right? Which you might be familiar with. It also augments beyond, the technologies. It augments the expert and citizen data scientists by automating many aspects of data science itself. So we're not just automating the technology, we're also automating actual data science, machine learning, AI model development, the management of AI models, as well as deployment. So augmented analytics is an approach of data analytics that employs the use of machine learning and natural language processing to automate analysis processes that would normally be done by a specialist or a data scientist. And it's a relatively new term. It was only introduced in a 2017 Gartner research paper. So we've only been making use of this kind of idea of augmented analytics for a couple of years now. Due to the underlying complexities of AI and machine learning, there's still a prominent focus on the technologies itself, rather than how regular people will interact with and benefit with these things. So alongside the misconceptions of machines taking people's jobs, this can stall the adoption of solutions that offer really practical benefits to people who work with data. People won't use AI and augmented analytics if they don't understand and trust in the value. And I think we can get a little bit confused sometimes between kind of what is augmented analytics and what is automation. So automation is a really common feature inside of augmented analytics solutions, but it's important to understand the difference between automating tasks, as many technologies already do every day, versus automating the decision-making that analytics informs. So automating data-driven decision-making takes away the need for human capability, whereas augmentation provides a methodology for underlying technology to guide users to uncover insights they might not see or discover otherwise. Domain knowledge has always been really important for analysis, but augmented analytics fueled by AI and machine learning make this skill set even more critical to bring in that domain knowledge to really have that critical thinking. There's often gaps where humans are going to need to fill in the necessary context and use the insights gained from analytics to help make the best decisions for the problem at hand. So if this isn't a term that you've kind of run into before, it's like, okay, well, who's using augmented analytics? What is it used for? Business users and executives I've worked with as a consultant get incredible value from augmented analytics because these technologies help to get value from data really quickly without the need for deep technical skills or expertise in working with data. So as a consultant and a technologist, maybe that's bad news for me in the next few years, but it's really good news for business because business users and executives are going to be able to more easily find relevant data, ask the best questions, and really quickly uncover insights in the context of their particular business. So, I talk a lot about the benefit of augmented analytics for those who don't have deep analytical expertise, but inside your workplaces, this can also be helping analysts and advanced users to perform more thorough analysis and data preparation tasks even faster. So coming back to sort of our slides at the very beginning, when we're thinking about this idea of humans versus machines and how this all fits together, it's important to remember we're usually in our best position as workers when we are partnering with machines. MIT economics professor Richard Buchstaber put it simply in his book, The End of Theory, with this quote: "No man is better than a machine, and no machine is better than a man with a machine." I think this really summarizes the synthesis approach, which realizes that both machines and humans have shortcomings, right? Well, what does that mean? Like, okay, we've sort of got this idea of like what augmented analytics are, how machines are supplementing and moving our work forward. But, you know, as we go back to our workplaces tomorrow or the next day, as managers, these conversations are not easy. Trying to introduce a conversation saying, yes, tomorrow we're going to partner with technology. I'm not sure it's a familiar way that we introduce things. And I think it's really easy for workers to be feeling replaceable and even entirely replaced with new technologies, which really drive forward new skills building activities, new processes, and new ways of working together in the workplace. And of course, you know, technology is not in its own bubble. I do think we see some of this anxiety about partnering with machines, about not being explicit about how we're going to work with them. I see some of this anxiety driving part of the Great Resignation activity we've seen recently. So as leaders, I think we really need to be thoughtful about how we can drive technology initiatives that workers want to be part of rather than being resistant to them, you know, in the best way possible. So there is a technology acceptance model, which comes out of, you know, some research in how we interact with tech. And it proposes that the perceived ease of use and the usefulness of a technological tool will determine the extent of consumer acceptance, right? So we can think about that when we're building for clients, but we can also think as managers, as leaders, the consumer in our case being our employees, who will receive the technology and have to embed it into their everyday work lives and partner with the tools while upskilling themselves and receiving new training and expectations along with it, right? It's a big ask. Just taking a quick look at what this model looks like. This here is the simplest formulation. So you can go and find research papers now that have extended the technology acceptance model to think about what other external factors there are, how we introduce change, all of that. But it's in its simplest formulation. We have this diagram here, and we can imagine employees are the box in the middle. Behavioral intent to use, right? That means that as an employee, will I adopt this technology? Will I take hold of it as it's handed to me and make use of it? Or am I going to resist, stage a coup, you know, whatever, and ensure that the technology doesn't get through? Behavioral intent to use means, is this person accepting the model or not accepting the model to move it forward into actual use in their workplace? And the step before that, the step before intent to use, is really driven by change management models and other external forces leaders can harness to define perceived usefulness of a technology and its perceived ease of use. The combination of these two, can I use it and why would I use it, along with the feeling of how easy will this be to use? You know, how hard is it going to be to change my whole entire process in the morning when I log into my computer? If we can change the perception of that before the technologies start to be implemented, then we can determine employee behaviors a little bit more when handed a technology. So as managers, we can use the TAM to understand that there are ways to influence technology acceptance by employees. But earlier this year, I was also reading an article by Student et al., you know, a little researchy, but basically the summary is here. What they did in their research article is summarize lots of different change management theories, from Lewin to Beer and Rafferty, and like every change management theory you can think of in business. They summarized them, all these different change management principles and sequences, and they both came up with principles, which I don't have presented here, but also sequential change management program steps, which is what is summarized here. And these 10 steps, it might feel a bit familiar for leadership, but I think it's important to highlight which one of these should be leading complex technological introduction and change in the workplace. So for example, in TAM, we learned that perceived usefulness and perceived ease of use both impact employee behavior. And that means that at the leadership level, we should be thinking about how we articulate our vision, a really strong vision from the beginning between leaders. Any leader at the table should be able to say, our vision of the future is making sure we can log into computers, whatever it is. I mean, obviously your vision needs to be a little stronger than that, but any person at the table, at the leadership table, should be able to articulate the same thing. And you can see in steps 5 and 6 here for change management, the leading of the rollout from leadership to employees should be spearheaded by key staff who also know the messaging and who are champions for the technology and the change that's going to come in. So you want to make sure, one, that you're clear between your leadership. You don't want infighting. You don't want people kind of undercutting other leaders at the table and being like, oh yeah, Mr. So-and-so believes that, but I think that change should look like this. No, your leadership message needs to be really clear before you start putting it out to champions. And then key champions and employees in the workplace who really enjoy digging into the tech should be kind of leading the conversations so that you can do your best to make sure the idea of how useful this tech is and how I can use it is really positive as you're kind of moving forward into that change management process. And then you can see kind of here 7 and 8, that once your messaging is strongly in place and being shared, folks are going to need new skills, right? And they will also need a reinforcement of the small wins they've had. It's not enough to just be like, you got to do new skills, you got to do new skills, you got to follow the champions. Like, stop and take a minute to thank people for how they are learning and upskilling and really embracing the change. And also take time and space to have open houses or forums or ask me anything kind of things with your leadership and with technologists so that people can say, hey, I really appreciate that the champions are moving forward, but I found this skill difficult because. So you want some, you want some ability for people to be able to come into a space and not feel like they're disrupting anything, and instead that you're sort of building together, and that there is space for them to express that sometimes things are not perfect. Because we know with technology, things are not always perfect. So all of this, importantly, if you look at these steps, comes before institutionalizing the change, or as leadership likes to say, putting in the policy. So get the change rolling first, champion it, make space for the wins and for some challenges, and then institutionalize how it suits the company. The last thing you want to do is to solidify and cement, not the first thing. And the one thing that we touched on there as well is that a key part of this upskilling with new technologies, it's not just how do I use this computer or how do I use whatever thing you handed me, but also data literacy and analytics proficiency overall. So while tools in augmented analytics and technology are certainly important parts of the greater movement for change and adaptation in the workplace, employees must also learn to think critically about the data. The data is not going to give you answers by itself. Acting on the wrong data will lead to bad decisions and wasted resources, or acting on the wrong recommendations from an AI system. And this is where data literacy, critical thinking, and people development will come in. Augmented analytics is only successful when organizations have prioritized analytics proficiency across departments so that people can confidently speak and understand the language of data. An explanation or a recommendation is only useful if someone else understands the data concepts and how they relate to their own business, right? Because you could be getting all kinds of junk data. I think there was, okay, this one I don't have the research paper, but I think when they were doing AI and visual recognition for wolves, it turned out that the AI was actually not recognizing wolves visually, but was recognizing patterns of snow and logs. And so the AI was being trained on snow and log identification, but could not identify a wolf if it was not covered in snow, right? And it seems kind of silly, but visually you can pick it up fast. In business contexts, You don't want to be running with a number or with an assumption or prediction that makes no sense. And that's why you need that domain knowledge and that augmentation, because only someone inside your company with some data literacy is going to know if it actually makes sense, because numbers aren't visual that way, right? You have to know what your business is about to be using this information. And finally, I'm going to wrap up a couple minutes early here, but the final thing that we can sort of think about when we're thinking about human versus machine is, how can we perform collaborative job crafting at the team and department levels to encourage employees to work together to reimagine processes and relationships. And these relationships are between themselves and their peers, themselves and leadership, as well as new relationships with technology and the processes actually needed to support those. That's the thing, is it's actually a new relationship to engage a new piece of technology in a workplace. And if we're not putting in the culture and the human support pieces to define those relationships, to say, hey, people are in charge and they're being supplemented, then, people are not necessarily going to know what to do with the relationship or how they should feel about it. So we don't want to be thinking human versus machine so much and how AI can take over our jobs and, make it really difficult. Instead, we want to work to understand how these enabling technologies can promote new augmentation, as well as offer some integration and automation with tasks that are always persistent in the workplace. And then we want to think about, how can we work to reimagine what our jobs look like and what new kinds of problems we can select for ourselves in the context of our teams as we unlock more time and creative energy and space in our workplaces. That's, on top of the perceived usefulness and the perceived ease of use, we also want to be thinking, how do I as a person fit into this context? What does it mean for my team to change this process? How can I really show some of my expertise in a new way that's supported by these technologies? Because it will still be a change. To ignore the fact that job crafting is involved in this is rather silly, because our jobs do change when you introduce technology. The relationship between us and how we deliver work, possibly the chain of command, depending on which pieces of technology you implement, all of those things change. And I think it's really important to acknowledge it and to work as a team to say, well, this is what the new flow will look like, and this is how each of us fit into that. So I know that was probably a lot of information in a small period of time. Thank you so much for your time today. Again, I'm Naomi Freeman. I'm working as a subject matter expert at NOROP Accelerate, where we're building skills programs for the future, both in tech and technical management. So feel free to reach out, naomi.freeman@norop.no, if you're interested in finding out more about the programs we run, or building technical management programs for your workplace. Myself, I'm always interested in how we leverage the value of technology, and I'd love to have more conversations about that. Thanks so much.
Amazing, Naomi. Well, thank you so much for joining us here. I've written down so many notes, and I think we've got a moment or two here to potentially answer some questions. And it's really interesting to me that very delicate balance that you talk about with AI, that it's a case of acknowledging the pain points, right? And the fears, that the well-founded fears, if we're being honest about kind of, my job is going to be changing. Am I going to lose my job? And then the understanding the value and trust, but then also, trying to educate as well. Now, one thing you didn't perhaps touch on as much is the outside facts, right? We can talk about internal, what's going to happen with your job and the trust and the value of it internally, but externally, and we spoke about it earlier this morning in the festival, there are some very scary use cases of how AI has gone wrong. In many instances, whether that be finance, whether it be facial recognition, etc. How do you work to balance the internal things that you can control and you can fully explain versus things that are totally out of your control? Other organizations have done these things. How do you balance that?
I think it's a really interesting question. And for me, the key with all of this technological change is always thinking as companies and as people where our culture and values are and what our own boundaries are. And much like, you know, being with your family at Christmas, you're going to have to set your own boundaries. And there's only so much control we can exert over an entire changing landscape. I think it's important when we think about things like I'm talking about with job crafting or change management, that as teams and as organizations, at least for our place where we exist, we can think about what those relationships mean. And I think sometimes when we hear about some of the cases with facial recognition or VW or whatever's been happening, I feel like things got out of hand because people stopped having conversations. Now, don't get me wrong, like, I know it's not perfect. We can't just like have a conversation and everything's fixed. But if people knew how they could express their concerns, if people knew where they fit into the change management process, if people knew what they're allowed to say is, this is my boundary as a technologist, this is my boundary here, and know where their job safety was, then perhaps some of these outcomes wouldn't have been as extreme or as accelerated. I do think we need to be creating that psychological safety inside of workplaces within our teams to know that we as people are leading this change, and, you know, to try and buffer a little bit of what's happening there with the technology.
Absolutely, and I could not agree with you more on that psychological safety point, especially as if you do express to a manager or your direct report saying, I'm worried that I'm going to lose my job. That could be interpreted as, I'm now looking for a new job because I don't feel secure in it. So therefore, you know, you've got that worry. So I completely agree there. Now, I do wonder, in the final few moments that we've got here together, Naomi, obviously you've spoken with so many different organizations on this sort of topic. Is there any stories you can share of good collaboration between the data function and the business as well? Because obviously that's a lot of what this is, right? Is collaborating effectively together. Any perhaps forums or methods of bringing people together that you think have been particularly good?
One thing that I've seen so I'm currently based in Norway, and they have a lot of really big assets. We're talking ships that go out to sea for 18 months with no maintenance. We're talking wind turbines. We're talking hydroelectric plants, like really heavy, big assets. And one thing I've really seen work here is ensuring, and I wasn't prepared for this part of the talk, but there's that old guy that's been there in the company for time gone by, as long as the dinosaurs, and he knows things. And he knows things intuitively. He can hear the sound of a hydro dam and know that it is not operating correctly. He knows things. And I think when you start to bring in some of these data-driven decision-making tools, it's really important in the first couple of steps to make sure that there's a user interface between the data that's being churned and somebody like that guy who is able to hit the stop button at any time, as well as having a process for reflection to try and understand why he hit that button. And especially when you're thinking about heavy assets and big machinery, this is a lot of money, like a lot of money. It's not as simple as like shutting down a little software program that's running your team email. So there needs to be, kind of from the business process side, that stuff. But we've also found that it's able to create better domain context in understanding what the data means, so that we can move faster through how that data is being manipulated. So that's something I would recommend, is including that guy, giving him an interface to work with for some defined period of time to learn more about it.
Amazing. Well, Naomi, thank you so much for joining me here today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been amazing.